It started with a shovel hitting something hard in the soil. At the two men digging on a quiet hill in eastern Germany thought it was just another piece of scrap metal buried underground. The place had seen centuries of history, and finding old fragments wasn't unusual. But when they pulled the object free and brushed away the dirt, what emerged was strange. It was a round bronze disc, dark with age, about the size of a dinner plate, and embedded into its surface were thin shapes of gold, a circle, a crescent, and a scattered pattern of tiny dots. It didn't look like a weapon. It didn't look like jewelry. It looked intentional. Almost like a map, but if that guess was correct, it created a serious problem. Because according to everything historians believed at the time, people in Bronze Age Europe weren't supposed to understand the sky like that. The strange disc wasn't discovered by archaeologists. It was found by two treasure hunters using metal detectors, digging illegally on a wooded hill known. They weren't looking for history. They were looking for something they could sell. When the detectors screamed, they started digging fast. A few strikes of the shovel later, the bronze disc appeared, along with several other objects buried beside it. 2 swords, axes, a chisel, and fragments of bracelets. All of them ancient, all of them valuable. But the disc was different. The men didn't clean it carefully or document the location. They scraped the soil off with a knife, accidentally damaging the surface, then threw everything into a bag. Within hours, the objects were already moving through the black market. To them, it was just another artifact. But the disc was about to travel through collectors, smugglers, and secret deals, before finally landing in the hands of people who would realize what it actually was. And when they did, the real mystery began. When archaeologists finally saw the disc, the first reaction wasn't excitement. It was confusion. The bronze surface was almost 30 centimeters wide, darkened by centuries underground. But what immediately caught their attention were the gold shapes carefully embedded into it. A large circle, a curved crescent, and a cluster of small golden dots scattered across the surface. Anyone who looked at it for more than a few seconds began to notice something unsettling. The symbols looked familiar, almost too familiar. The crescent resembled the moon, the large circle could be interpreted as the sun, and the cluster of dots looked strikingly similar to the Pleiades, one of the most recognizable star groups in the night sky. If that interpretation was correct, it meant the disk was showing an actual astronomical scene, and that created a serious problem. Because according to everything historians believed at the time, the people living in Bronze Age Central Europe weren't supposed to have that level of astronomical knowledge. For decades, historians believed they had a clear picture of Europe during the Bronze Age. Around 3,600 years ago, most communities in Central Europe were thought to be relatively simple. They farmed, raised animals, traded metals, and built small settlements scattered across the landscape. Their tools and weapons showed impressive craftsmanship, but their scientific knowledge, at least according to the dominant theory, was limited. Serious astronomy, scholars believed, belonged somewhere else. Civilizations like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia were known for carefully observing the sky, tracking celestial movements, and connecting them to calendars and agriculture. But in Central Europe, the prevailing idea was different. People here may have watched the stars, of course, but not in a systematic or sophisticated way. So when researchers looked at the bronze disc, with what appeared to be precise symbols of the sun, moon, and stars, something didn't add up. If the object truly came from the European Bronze Age, then the story historians had been telling about this period might be missing something important. At first, some researchers suspected the disc might be a forgery. After all, the idea that a Bronze Age object could depict the sky so clearly sounded almost too perfect. But when scientists began examining the surface more closely, they noticed something far more interesting than the stars themselves. Along the edges of the disk, there were 2 curved golden arcs. They looked like decorative additions at first glance, but their position seemed strangely precise. When researchers measured the angle between the arcs, they discovered something unexpected. The distance between them matched the exact angle between the sunrise and sunset during the summer and winter solstices at that latitude. In other words, the disk wasn't just showing the sky. It appeared to encode how the sky moved. If that interpretation was correct, the object might have been used to track the calendar itself, linking the movement of the sun and moon to the seasons. And that realization raised a much bigger question. What else were the people who made this disk capable of understanding? By the early 2000s, the disk had finally reached professional archaeologists. But there was a problem. Because it had been dug up illegally, its origin was uncertain. Without a verified excavation site, the entire object could still be dismissed as a clever fake. So investigators decided to do something unusual. Instead of studying only the disk, they went after the people who had found it. German authorities launched an operation to track the artifact through the black market. After several undercover negotiations with dealers, police organized a sting operation in a hotel in Switzerland. When the disk was presented for sale, officers moved in and seized it, along with the other objects found in the same burial. Now archaeologists finally had what they needed. The weapons, tools, and fragments buried with the disk could be dated and analyzed. And if all of them truly came from the same place and time, the mystery of the disk would finally face its most important test. Once the disk was recovered, scientists began examining everything connected to it. The swords, axes, and bracelets found in the same hoard were carefully analyzed and dated to around 1600 BC, placing them firmly in the European Bronze Age. But the most decisive tests were done on the disk itself. Researchers studied the corrosion patterns on the bronze, the microscopic wear on the gold inlays, and even the chemical composition of the metals. The copper matched ore deposits used in Bronze Age Central Europe, while the gold traced back to ancient river deposits in what is now the United Kingdom. Even the soil trapped in tiny crevices on the disk matched the ground from the Middleburg Hill where it had been found. Piece by piece, the evidence kept pointing in the same direction. The disk was not a modern forgery. It was genuinely ancient. And that meant historians were now facing something far more disruptive. A Bronze Age object from Central Europe that appeared to encode real astronomical knowledge. As the evidence settled, researchers began to look at the disk in a completely different way. Instead of treating it as decoration, they started reading it like a tool. The golden circle likely represented the sun, or possibly the full moon. The curved crescent clearly matched the shape of a waxing moon, and the small cluster of stars lined up almost perfectly with the Pleiades, a star group that many ancient cultures used to mark important seasonal changes. Then came the key insight. By aligning the disk with the horizon and using the golden arcs on the sides, it could help track the position of the sun during the solstice. Combined with the moon and the Pleiades, the disk may have allowed its users to synchronize lunar and solar cycles, something essential for keeping an accurate agricultural calendar. In other words, this wasn't just art. It may have been one of the earliest known attempts in Europe to represent the sky and use it to measure time. Once the pieces came together, the implications became hard to ignore. If the disk truly functioned as an astronomical guide, it meant that people in Central Europe during the Bronze Age weren't just observing the sky casually. They were studying it, recognizing patterns, and turning those patterns into practical knowledge. Tracking the relationship between the sun, the moon, and star clusters like the Pleiades would have allowed them to predict seasonal shifts more accurately, crucial for planting, harvesting, and organizing life around the rhythm of the year. It also hinted at something even bigger. Knowledge like this rarely appears in isolation. It spreads through trade, travel, and cultural exchange. The metals in the disk already suggested connections across long distances, and the astronomical ideas might have traveled similar routes. Suddenly, Bronze Age Europe looked less isolated than historians once believed. And that realization forced researchers to reconsider just how advanced and interconnected these societies might have been. Today, the disk is known as one of the most remarkable artifacts ever found in Europe. What began as an illegal dig on a quiet hill ended up revealing something far bigger than a buried treasure. The object is now recognized as the Nebra Sky Disk, and it's widely considered the oldest known concrete depiction of the cosmos anywhere in the world. A small bronze circle, carrying the sun, the moon, and a cluster of stars. It showed that more than 3,000 years ago, people in this part of Europe weren't just living day to day. They were watching the sky carefully, noticing patterns, and turning those patterns into knowledge that helped guide their lives. In other words, they understood something essential about the universe above them, and for decades, historians simply hadn't realized it yet. Sometimes it only takes a single object quietly waiting underground to force us to rethink what people in the past were truly capable of understanding.